Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 254, and we're going to talk about the Minoans, uh, the people of Minos that lived on the island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea. A little bit late today, primarily because, well, after teaching, I had to go to a police retirement banquet, right? Because I'm the one of the police chaplains of our township. So I had to do that, perform my functions there. Came back and now uploading this episode. I'd like to share with you a lesson from my sixth grade history book that I'm using, obviously, to teach sixth grade. It was a fantastic lesson on free trade. And it wasn't obviously represented that way, but I made it that way. And I used it to compare with other civilizations which focused on plunder. Obviously, in that age, most people believe that force, right? If you're the stronger nation, you just take from other people. And that is generally what most people, how they understand old school civilizations to be. They just would try to war and conquer with each other. And so I thought it was really interesting that this civilization on the island of Crete, which is about 5,000 years old, 3000 BCE or BC to about 1100 BCE. The dates are a little bit tricky. But looking it up on the internet in Britannica Encyclopedia, these are the dates, and there are a lot of breakdowns and phases, rises and falls. But that generally is what it is. 5,000 years ago, this civilization starts on Crete, and most of us might have heard of it from the Greek mythology, where it talks about uh, palaces which have labyrinths, and inside the labyrinth is a minotaur or a man-like person with a bull head, right? And that story comes from paintings and frescoes that are found in the palaces on the island of Crete. All right, that's to give the sort of background. So Sir Arthur Evans, in the 20th century, started excavating Knossos in 1900 to 1905, and he discovered ruins. Now, the textbook that I'm using is that they didn't discover this civilization on the island of Crete until about 1870. So for about, I don't know, 3,000 years, no one knew about this civilization on the island of Crete. And but this is what it says, and I'm pretty much going to read from the text. Like the Fertile Crescent, Crete had rich soil, perfect climate, and plenty of water. With less time spent battling for a living, the Cretans began to make complicated objects. They cut down their large trees and built ships to sail the blue Mediterranean. From the wild crocus flower, which covered their island with a golden mantle, the Cretans collected the saffron, used in yellow dye, in food, and in medicine. And I looked up the medicine component, and there is an article in the Historical Review Journal from 1996 which discusses this medicine. And they only can call it medicine because they don't know what the diseases were they were fighting. So, what was this medicine that they were using? And why don't we know these things? Well, because even though there are written records from on the island, found on the island, no one knows how to read that language. It's a forgotten language, and so no one really can understand what was going on the island. I will continue. With products to trade, the Cretans visited other lands. From the Egyptians, they secured rich fabrics and jewels. From the Anatolian Hittites, they learned how to use iron. From the wealthy Lydians, they learned to coin money. From Phoenicia, the Cretans obtained an alphabet. And that's pretty much where it ends. And so this very brief mention of this civilization was just sort of like another story of a successful civilization. And it goes on to say that well, I believe this in one of the encyclopedias that I was looking at, is that on the island, it lacked fortifications, right? Like defensive structures. And so the conclusion is that it was a peaceful nation, right? They didn't need to build castles or forts because they were peaceful and everyone treated them peacefully as well. But they did find weapons, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And eventually the Greeks, right? So 1100 BCE is when you see the rise of the Greeks from, the peninsula there, and they start raiding, attacking, and eventually they conquer the island. There is some speculation, though, that earthquakes and volcano eruptions didn't help or might have been the main cause for people to abandon the island until the 8th century BCE when the Greeks colonized the island. So that was basically the small, short passage. And, when I read that in class last year, when we read it together in class last year, uh, I was amazed. It was pretty incredible. And all the creators are looking at me like I'm nuts, right? And but it's sort of like there he goes again. And so I explained to them, look, don't you see what this means? That wealth is generated from trade, not plunder, right? And so they're trying to understand what I was saying. I said, look, according to Say's law, I left that part out. But anyway, according to Say's law, you got to first produce something which other people would want to have, and you trade that for the stuff you don't have, but you want. And as we can see, all the different parts of the Mediterranean where they got different things, they were able to get it because of the dye that they got from the flower and the medicine. So I would emphasize the fact that all they had was a flower, right? Which grew everywhere. They took that flower, turned it into dye and medicine, and then traded that with everybody else all around the Mediterranean to get the stuff that they wanted. And they created an incredibly prosperous civilization. And if you do a little bit more research, and there's not a whole lot there, so you can read it pretty quickly. Although I did see some documentaries, and I'll probably check that out later. But uh, just from the flower, they were able to generate all this wealth. Now, in contrast, right, to get these guys to understand, fully comprehend what I was trying to get at, I said, think about it. They're making all this stuff, very complex stuff, very ornate stuff, I guess, for the time, and they start trading with other people. Now, think about what happens when you plunder another civilization. Like, let's pretend you're Vikings and you see this really wealthy, prosperous society. So you go there, you kill everyone, and you take all their stuff. Well, you just murdered all of the people who created all that wealth. And so if all you do is consume wealth, eventually you run out of the stuff that you just stole from those people. So now you got to plunder another group of people. But your civilization doesn't know how to make anything. You don't produce anything. And so as even though you go around the world stealing from other people because you're stronger, eventually you kill everybody and now you're poor. But what's worse is that you don't know how to make any of the stuff that you stole from other people. And they quickly understood this, that it was like, oh, yeah, right? It's like killing the golden goose, right? Or the goose that lays the golden egg. You don't do that. You have to somehow preserve them. And you know what? Why don't we get busy, produce something so we can trade with them? So the more trade that happens, the less necessary are wars and therefore the weapons of war. And so I did mention earlier that they did find weapons and guardhouses throughout the island. And that's probably because the Greeks or the Mycenaeans, they started to raid the island. And so in order to protect themselves, they started having weapons. I also think that if you're a prosperous nation, you're able to create all this wealth, you also have a flourishing academic or a thinking community. And they would have worked out that, hey, we need to defend ourselves in the event someone decides to invade us. But I think it was a low risk because think about it, right? Everything, they're trading with everybody. And the only way you're going to be able to get to Crete to invade it is you have to have your own navy or be friendly with a nation that has a large navy. But if you do have a navy and you have these barbarians, let's just call them, say, hey, I'll hire you and split the plunder when we go invade Crete. Now, the people who have lots of ships, what they would probably say, like it would take a lot of convincing or they stole all the ships. But if your livelihood and your prosperity depends on free trade with Crete, then plundering them is not a choice. Like you're not going to want to do that because once you do that, you might have short-term gain, but in the long term, who are you going to trade with, right? You lose your trading partner. And so it's better than to trade instead of thinking about how to steal from them. And for that reason, if it's true that they're a largely peaceful nation, then they never really had to develop a military or a navy even, because the fact that they were able to produce products of quality was their protection, right? The fact that they had the ability to produce and therefore trade with other people, something that everybody wanted, that was their protection, right? If they're the golden goose, or the goose that lays golden eggs, you don't kill that goose because you still want those eggs. And so once I established that point, everyone kind of gets it, right? Even the meanest of students, right, in terms of intelligent, they get it. They realize, right, murdering to get wealth is not that desirable, right? Because then it sets up someone else killing you and so forth. And that's simply not the way to live, to always be afraid that someone is going to murder you and take all your stuff. So once I establish that, then becomes a really easy sell to say, this is why war is never the answer, right? Negotiate, make a deal, bargain, compromise, do whatever, but war is never a good idea, right? And so people who go to war immediately, it means that there's something else up their sleeve because no one wins, no one gains in war. Sure, like I said, in the short term, maybe a little bit, but in the long term, no, it's a losing proposition. Now, people cover up the fact that it is such a bad idea by using emotion, right? Putin is so evil, so that's why we have to, he won't negotiate with us. He's so evil, he's unable to negotiate. And these are people who, of course, believe all of the propaganda, the one-sided bias presentation of information that we've been talking about, that we've talked about several times before. And so uh, they cover up this lack of wisdom position by focusing on the emotion, getting people to get so angry that war becomes a viable top solution or choice to resolve this problem. But the argument of peace is always the winner, right? And I did it again today. Like someone was trying to justify, uh, violent action against someone. And I'm like, yeah, no, I don't think so. Like if you had to go ask all those people who died and then talk to their families who lost loved ones. And you say, which would you rather have? A negotiated peace with this supposed ruthless person or death and war? without exception, everyone always says, yeah, better just to have negotiated peace. And we know, like 18 months ago, like March of 2023, 2023, 2022, that Ukraine was going to have a settlement with Russia, and that deal was broken up by the United States through Boris Johnson. So it's not a tough call to try to look for peace, how to maintain peace instead of going to war and engaging in violence. But our society has moved away, so far away from real learning, real critical thinking, that people hear about violence and war and they think it's a great idea. It's more likely that people will act and live with violence. That's the whole Karen phenomena, right? Without even thinking about personal safety and de-escalation, they just go right for the jugular right from the very beginning. And that's where you get the whole screw around and find out the FAFO phenomena, right? But it's because people are out of touch with information, with the understanding of subjectivity, of bias, that violence becomes a viable choice for many people, and it just really is not. So for this small batch of students that I'm able to teach, it's a great lesson. And, when I talk about current events and I explain to them, what's going on, they know immediately that the aggressor, the one who is causing or even encouraging all this violence, is definitely not the person who is thinking rationally or even is wise. And you have to realize, I don't know if you go to church or affiliated with any kind of religious organization, but and they've told me their churches talk a lot about the war in Israel. And once they start thinking and realizing that war is definitely not the way to go, now it calls into question a lot of the things that they've been hearing, even at church. Um, yeah, which, hopefully they never bring it up until they get older. But it is kind of a cool thing to be able to see that even sixth graders, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds understand this very basic argument that violence and destruction doesn't benefit anyone in the long term, and instead just creates a lot of poverty, a lot of misery, and a lot of ill feeling. So hopefully this idea, this understanding of free trade and how it leads to prosperity, how it leads people to have a better quality of life and to be able to enjoy a life of peace with the people that they love. I mean, we gotta we gotta sell this, yeah, tell other people about this choice, this alternative that all of us can have, and maybe start holding some of these politicians and deep state affiliated people accountable for all of the incredibly asinine choices that they're making in our name today. And that's it for today. Hope you had a great weekend. I'll talk to you guys next week.